There is a particular kind of silence at the bottom of the world. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something beneath it. A pressure. A stillness so complete that it registers as a physical weight on the chest. The men who have been to Antarctica, the scientists, the naval officers, the cartographers who spent weeks on the shelf ice in rubber-soled boots and wolfskin mittens, they describe it the same way regardless of era or nationality. They describe the feeling of being watched. January 1939. The Southern Ocean is grinding. Ice plates the size of suburbs collide without ceremony. The temperature is somewhere around -28°C. The sky is white. The horizon is white. The only color is the black of open water, and even that looks wrong, too still, too dark, as though it absorbs light rather than reflects it. Somewhere off the Princess Martha coast, a German research vessel called the MS Schwabenland rides at anchor. On her deck, 2 Dornier flying boats sit on steam catapults, engines cold. The crew has been at sea for 33 days. They are tired. Some are frightened, though none of them would say so. They are here officially for whale oil. That is the public record. That is what the crew of 82 were told when they departed Hamburg on the 17th of December, 1938, that they were mapping new whaling grounds, scouting viable coastline, performing routine geomagnetic surveys. The men who were there call it something else. Among the documents that survived the war, a fraction of what was produced, much of it lost in the firebombings of German cities, the rest buried or classified until the late 1950s, there are pages that have never been widely discussed. Field notes from the expedition's geophysicist. Acoustic logs from the ship's hydrophone equipment. A handwritten memo, unsigned, dated February 3, 1939, that contains a single phrase in the margin. Pulsation metallisch. Quelle unbekannt. If you value real-world mysteries recovered from the fringes of history, told without embellishment, without sensationalism, stay with me. Because what happened under the ice in Queen Maud Land in January and February of 1939 was documented, classified, and then largely forgotten. And what came after it, the American naval response, the abrupt end to a massive military expedition, the decades of contradictory silence, forms one of the strangest Cold War-era footnotes ever recovered from a public archive. This is not a story about monsters. It is not a story about alien spacecraft or occult rituals or lost civilizations. It is a story about what serious men heard and could not explain. To understand what the German scientists reported, you first need to understand why they were there at all. By 1938, the Third Reich was consuming resources at a pace its domestic production could not sustain. Among the most critical shortages was fat, specifically industrial whale oil, used in margarine, in lubricants, and munitions production. Germany had been purchasing it from Norway, but Hitler's economic planners had determined that this dependency was a strategic vulnerability. They needed their own supply chain. They needed whaling grounds. And so, under the authority of Hermann Göring, then commissioner for the 4-year plan, an expedition was organized in 6 months. Its cover was scientific. Its mandate included cartographic survey, weather observation, oceanographic profiling, and the formal claiming of territory. Captain Alfred Richer led it. He was 59 years old, a decorated World War I naval aviator, not a party ideologue. He selected his crew based on polar experience, not party membership. There was one Nazi official required aboard by regulation. The rest were sailors, scientists, and aviators from the Lufthansa Atlantic Service. They left Hamburg on the 17th of December, 1938. They reached the Antarctic coast on the 19th of January, 1939. Over the next 28 days, the expedition's 2 Dornier Wal seaplanes, Passat and Boreas, flew 15 survey missions, covering a photographed zone of roughly 250,000 square kilometers. 16,000 aerial photographs, biological specimens collected from the sea ice, geomagnetic readings logged twice daily, and echo sounder surveys of the ocean floor, surveys that would later be found to have identified the mid-Atlantic ridge, though no one on the Schwabenland knew what they were looking at. The territory between 10 degrees west and 15 degrees east was formally named Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, a German colony, at least in intention, at the bottom of the world. They planted metal darts in the ice, aluminum stakes a meter long with swastika fins, airdropped at the turning points of the flight polygons to mark the territorial claim. Some were lost. None have ever been recovered. The smell of the Schwabenland's engine room was diesel and wet wool. The mess decks ran on ersatz coffee and hardtack. The scientists worked in shifts, their breath fogging the instrument panels, their hands going numb through their gloves when they stepped outside to collect readings. It was in the third week of operations that the hydrophone data began to show something no one had anticipated. The Schwabenland was equipped with a towed hydrophone array, an acoustic listening device designed for oceanographic profiling. It was not a military instrument. It was used to detect depth variations, submarine geological features, the faint echo returns of the seabed below. On the night of January 27, 1939, the watch officer logged an anomaly.
I had the midnight watch. The ship was stationary, holding position approximately 14 nautical miles off the coast. The hydrophone operator, I will not use his name out of respect for his family, came to me in the passageway. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had been at sea since 1921. He said to me very quietly that there was a sound he could not account for. I went with him to the instrument station. He put on the headset and handed it to me. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine a very low hum, below the range where you hear it as a sound, more pressure in the jaw and the sinuses. And within that hum, at intervals of approximately 40 seconds, a pulse, like a hammer striking metal inside a large metal chamber. Tonal, regular, mechanical. We checked the ship's own systems. Engines were at minimum idle. The generator was running normally. The propeller shaft was locked. We checked the other vessels. There were none within radio range. We checked our own towed array for contamination. Nothing explained it. The sound continued for approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes. Then it stopped. Completely. The sea returned to background noise, as if whatever had been producing that sound simply ceased. I wrote it in the log. I wrote it precisely as I have just told you. By the time we reached Hamburg, someone had drawn a single line through that entry in pencil. Not erased, crossed out. And next to it, in a different hand, a note that read, "Recheck instrument calibration."
The hydrophone anomaly of January 27th was not an isolated event. It was the first of 5 documented acoustic incidents during the Schwabenland's operating window in Queen Maud Land. The second occurred on February 1st, during an aerial survey flight by the seaplane Boreas. The crew, pilot Rudolf Mayer and observer Richard Heinrich Skirmacher, reported a magnetic compass deviation of approximately 14 degrees as they passed over a zone at approximately 72 degrees south latitude. The deviation lasted for the duration of their transit over a specific inland area, then corrected itself as they exited the zone. Skirmacher would later name a chain of small ice-free lakes in this region. They still bear his name today on modern maps of Queen Maud Land. Whether he ever told anyone what his compass did above that area, the instruments do not say.
Do you copy? Copy Boreas. Go ahead. We are at grid reference 72 south, 06 east. Compass is 14 degrees off. We have it marked. No cloud interference. Wind is calm. Confirmed. Continue survey. Log deviation. Understood. Also, there is something on the ice below us. A discoloration. Circular. We'll photograph. Copy. Return to base on schedule. Understood. Boreas out.
The photograph Skirmacher referenced was among the 11,000 images taken during the expedition. A large portion of those photographs were destroyed during World War II. Of the roughly 1,100 that survived and were rediscovered in a German archive in 1982, the frame corresponding to that grid reference and that flight time does not appear in the catalog sequence. It is not marked destroyed. It is simply absent. What separates a documented anomaly from a mystery is pattern. Singular events have explanations. Singular events can be attributed to instrument error, observer fatigue, atmospheric interference. Pattern is harder to dismiss. 12 years after the Schwabenland departed Queen Maud Land, a joint scientific expedition returned to the same region. The Norwegian-British-Swedish Antarctic expedition of 1949 to 1952 was a legitimate scientific undertaking. The first overland traverse of Dronning Maud Land's interior, conducted by a team of glaciologists, geologists, surveyors, and geophysicists. Among their primary objectives was seismic sounding, The use of explosive charges detonated in the ice to measure ice thickness through reflected shock waves. Standard methodology for the period. Done at dozens of stations across the traverse. At one station, catalogued in the expedition's geophysical records at approximately 71 degrees 40 south, 8 degrees east, well within the territory the Germans had photographed from the air, the seismic team reported an anomalous return. In the language of geophysics, the shot generated two returns. One from the bedrock as expected, indicating ice thickness, and a second return, arriving before the bedrock echo. Earlier, shallower, from an elevation within the ice column that should have been a homogeneous medium. The expedition's chief glaciologist, Charles Swethenbank, later one of the most respected polar scientists of the 20th century, noted in his unpublished field journal that the anomalous return was consistent with a large, mechanically regular subsurface structure. He listed three possible explanations: a subglacial lake of unusual geometry, a crystallographic ice layer, or equipment error. He could not rule out equipment error. He noted it. He moved on. The data sat in institutional archives for decades. In August of 1946, the United States Navy announced Operation Highjump, one of the largest military expeditions ever mounted to the Antarctic. Task Force 68. 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. The official mission was cold weather training, photographic mapping, and logistics testing. The classified objectives included establishing a basis for American territorial claims and, according to later declassified documentation, electromagnetic and geological survey of specific sectors of the continent. One of those sectors was Queen Maud Land. The operation ran from December 1946 to late February 1947. It ended abruptly, earlier than planned, officially attributed to approaching winter conditions. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, who held titular command, gave an interview to the International News Service upon his return in which he said something that has been quoted, misquoted, and stripped of context ever since. What he said accurately was this: that Antarctica presented a potential strategic vulnerability. That the distance which had once protected America now meant nothing in the age of aviation. That the continent warranted serious attention. He did not say he was attacked. He did not say he encountered unknown technology. Those words were placed in his mouth by decades of embellishment. What is documented, from within the operation's own records, is that several aircraft experienced navigation instrument failures during survey flights over specific inland sectors of Queen Maud Land. That at least two missions were diverted without explanation, and that one pilot, Conrad Shin, later said to a Smithsonian historian, "We didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't know about precision flying or what we were looking at." That quote is usually read as a critique of poor planning, and it may well be, but there is another way to read it. That what they were looking at was simply not in any of their charts, not in any of their instrument manuals, not in any framework they had been given. In the 1990s and 2000s, as satellite and airborne radar technology revolutionized subglacial mapping, researchers discovered that Antarctica conceals a world beneath its ice. More than 400 subglacial lakes, connected by drainage channels, some holding water that has been sealed from the atmosphere for 15 to 35 million years. The largest of these, Lake Vostok, beneath Russia's Vostok Station in East Antarctica, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. When Russian drillers finally breached it in 2012, the water pressure drove the lake water up into the borehole. Samples were extracted. Microbial analysis was inconclusive about what lived there. In Queen Maud Land specifically, in the zone the Schwabenland surveyed, and which Highjump's aircraft flew over, aeromagnetic surveys conducted by the British Antarctic Survey in the 1990s detected what researchers described as an anomalous magnetic signature. A localized variation in the magnetic field, centered at depth, inconsistent with the known geology of the bedrock. The lead researcher filed the data. It was noted. There are two peer-reviewed papers referencing it. Neither paper draws a dramatic conclusion. Both papers suggest further investigation. The further investigation has not yet been completed. Whether that is because of funding, logistics, or something else, the record does not say. We return now to the Schwabenland. The final week of the expedition's operating window, February 1939. The austral summer was ending. The sea ice was beginning to reform. Richter had already given the order to prepare for departure. Survey flights were winding down. Specimens were being packed. The hydrophone array had been recovered. Then, on the night of February 3rd, the incident that produced the crossed-out log entry. What the reconstructed record tells us, and I want to be precise here because the primary documents are partial and the provenance of some secondary sources is contested, is the following. At approximately 2300 hours, the watch officer logged a hydrophone contact. Not a faint background anomaly as in the January 27th event, but a strong, close, and directional signal. The bearing was landward, toward the coast from the direction of the ice shelf. The duty geophysicist was woken. He came to the instrument station in his bunk clothes.
What I heard that night I have not spoken about publicly. I am speaking now because I am old and because the man who told me to stay silent died in 1953 and I do not feel the obligation anymore. The signal was unlike anything in our instrument manuals. It was not biological. We knew what whale songs sounded like, what krill shoals produced, what deep pressure currents generated. This was none of those things. It was rhythmic, regular, like a large mechanical device operating at low frequency. The interval between pulses was consistent, 40 to 42 seconds. It held that interval for as long as we monitored it, 2 hours and 17 minutes by my watch. I calculated the bearing. I triangulated with a second instrument. The source was inland, under the ice shelf, at a depth I could not determine precisely, but deeper than the seabed we had charted. The sound was coming from below the seabed. I wrote my notes. Captain Richter was informed. He came to the station himself, listened, said nothing for approximately 10 minutes, and then said, "Log it. We will report when we are home." We departed the following morning, February 5th. We arrived in Hamburg on April 11th. I was debriefed by two men I did not recognize and did not see again. My instrument logs from the period January 27th through February 4th were taken from me at that debrief. I retained only my personal field notebook, which I had not surrendered because I had not been asked specifically for it. I still have it.
That testimony was given in 1961. The academic who received it published a partial summary in a German scientific journal in 1963. The journal is obscure. The summary is dry, stripped of any language that might suggest drama. It describes only that a hydroacoustic anomaly of uncertain origin was recorded during the expedition's final operational week. The geophysicist is not named. No formal follow-up was ever conducted. This is where responsible examination requires a pause. There are legitimate geophysical processes that produce low-frequency acoustic signals beneath Antarctic ice. Tidal flexing of ice shelves generates rhythmic microseismic events. Subglacial water drainage, the movement of meltwater beneath kilometers of ice, produces acoustic signatures that ground-penetrating instruments can detect. Geothermal activity, present in parts of Antarctica though notably sparse in Queen Maud Land, can generate sustained low-frequency emissions. The interval the German geophysicist described, 40 to 42 seconds, does not correspond to known tidal cycles, which operate on much longer periods. It does not correspond to documented icequake signatures, which are irregular. It does not correspond to known biological sources. Could the instruments have been faulty? Yes. Could observer fatigue have created or amplified a perception of regularity in random noise? Possibly. Could there be a completely natural explanation that 1939 geophysics simply lacked the vocabulary to identify? Absolutely. The record does not require a supernatural explanation. It requires only honesty about what remains unresolved. And what remains unresolved, after 3 separate expeditions, after decades of aeromagnetic and seismic survey work, after the development of technology that has mapped the continent's subglacial floor to a resolution of 1 kilometer, is this. In a specific zone of Queen Maud Land, at depths consistent with the bedrock ice interface or below, there is a magnetic anomaly that has not been explained by the known geology. There are seismic return signals from the 1951 traverse that were logged as anomalous and never revisited. And there are 3 separate acoustic records, 1939, 1947, and a lesser-known note from a Soviet weather station in the 1970s, that describe low-frequency, rhythmic, directional signals originating from beneath the ice. 3 records. 3 different national expeditions. 3 different instrument types. The same description. The Schwabenland expedition's full scientific results were held under German wartime classification until 1942. In 1942, the war effort consumed the institutions that held them. A large portion of the expedition's aerial photographs, specifically the images from the final week of survey operations, were listed as lost. The geophysical logs for the final operational week were held separately from the biological and meteorological data and were not included in the post-war publication of the expedition's scientific findings, released between 1954 and 1958. Operation Highjump was classified confidential at its commencement. The classification was not elevated. The full operational report was released later in 1947. It is available in archives. Researchers have read it. It contains no reference to acoustic anomalies or instrument failures over Queen Maud Land. This is either because there were none, or because the material was held separately from the operational report. In 1958, 9 years after Highjump, the United States detonated 3 nuclear devices in the Antarctic region as part of a classified program called Operation Argus. The program tested the effect of nuclear explosions on Earth's magnetic field. The choice of location was not arbitrary. Historians have connected Highjump and Argus as part of a general Cold War push to assert American influence over Antarctic territory. That is the most plausible explanation. It is not the only explanation consistent with the timeline. Antarctica is the least known continent on Earth. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about what lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. We have mapped less than 20% of the subglacial bedrock at useful resolution. We have drilled into the continent's interior at fewer than a dozen sites. We have never placed instruments on the bedrock at the zone in question. Not in 1939, not in 1947, not in 2024. What the German scientists of the Schwabenland reported was real, in the sense that they reported it. Whether what produced those reports was geological, mechanical, atmospheric, or something else, that question has never been formally investigated. The documents that would allow the most rigorous analysis are either destroyed, classified, or sitting in an archive somewhere waiting for someone to recognize what they are. Combat, or in this case, the extreme conditions of polar exploration, does something to the threshold of human perception. When men are cold, sleep-deprived, isolated, and working with instruments at the edge of their technical capability, the margin between anomaly and error narrows. The Germans on the Schwabenland had been at sea for 33 days when the first acoustic event occurred. They were not rested. They were not comfortable. But sleep deprivation does not produce consistent instrument readings on independently calibrated devices. And the 40-second pulse interval reported by the Schwabenland's geophysicist, cross-checked against another instrument, logged by a watch officer, and later described in nearly identical terms by a Soviet observer 30 years later, is not the kind of detail that human exhaustion typically fabricates with such precision. I'm not telling you what was under the ice. I am telling you that something registered on the instruments of 3 different expeditions, from 3 different nations across 3 different decades, in the same geographic zone, producing descriptions close enough that the word coincidence starts to feel like intellectual evasion. The Schwabenland returned to Hamburg on April 11, 1939. Within 5 months, Germany was at war. The expedition's planned follow-up voyage was cancelled. Captain Richer never returned to Antarctica. The geophysicist whose instrument logs were taken in the debrief died in 1958, the same year the expedition's scientific findings were finally published, without the hydroacoustic data. The aluminum swastika darts are still out there, somewhere under the snow. No one has found them. The photographs from the flight on February 1, 1939, are still missing from the archive sequence. The anomalous magnetic signature over Queen Maud Land is still in the aeromagnetic database, still unexplained, still waiting for the funding and the will to drill. The ice holds what is given to it. It does not speak, but it does pulse. 40 seconds. 42. 40. War writes many things into the record. Most of them we understand. The casualty lists, the supply manifests, the operational orders stamped secret and later declassified and filed in boxes in buildings that smell of old paper. But the things that did not fit the framework, the readings that could not be explained, the entries that were crossed out in pencil, the photographs that are simply absent from the sequence, those things also went into the record. They are harder to find. They require patience and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. If this is the kind of story that interests you, recovered from the margins of documented history, presented without conclusion, because the honest answer is that there is no conclusion, subscribe. There are more files to open. The ice at the bottom of the world is 4 kilometers deep in places. No human being has ever stood on the bedrock beneath it. No instrument has ever rested on the floor of whatever is down there. We do not know what we do not know. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all.